Imagine a day where children are guided and nurtured in a way that honors their unique humanness. A day where, instead of being expected to change in order to fit in, children can be met right where they're at. Welcome to Where They're Planted, a podcast for parents and care providers of unique children. Caring for a child with a developmental, emotional, or behavior challenge, a neurodiverse brain, or difficult early life experiences can be confusing and exhausting. On this podcast, we'll help your child flourish and strengthen their roots by helping you not only understand them, but also gain the skills to help them bloom where they're planted. We'll use brain science, nervous system tools, collaborative strategy sessions, and a deep understanding of the developmental process to create a fertile environment around your child in order to nurture their growth. I am your host, Jen Bluske, an occupational therapist with over 25 years of experience and a parent coach. My most closely held title, however, is that of a single mom of 2 thriving adopted kids, so I have walked this walk. I am truly excited to share, teach, and dive into these important topics on each episode.
Welcome back to Where They're Planted. I am so excited to be back today with my colleague Shannon Stuckey, occupational therapist and parent coach at Children's Therapy Network and Thriving Parents Collective. Today, we are going to have a conversation about finding safety in ourselves, finding safety in our relationships for the purpose of thinking about how we find safety for our children. We last week talked about meltdowns, and we know that the foundation of being able to function in our world is finding a sense of internal safety as we move through the world. So I'm very excited just to jump into the conversation today with Shannon. Hey, Shannon, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Welcome. I wanted to start with just a question about when we speak about safety, what do we actually mean by that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way I like to think about it is our like little tiny radars in our brain are up, and they are scanning within milliseconds of an encounter with someone, anyone. They're scanning for safety. And I read this somewhere, and I don't know who to return this to. It's based off of Stephen Porges's work on neuroception. But the idea of detection without awareness. So we are looking for a felt safety with the other person. And this is through how their face looks. This is how their posture is. This is how their movements, if they're moving or not. This is all through tiny, tiny little cues that our mammal brain is kind of taking in to register if this is going to be a safe exchange or not.
And so in these little sensors that we all have, and you referenced neuroception. Neuroception is one of my favorite topics to geek out on. So let's quickly define neuroception.
Well, yeah. How do you define it? I want to hear from you.
So when I think about neuroception, I think about the brain's ability to immediately decide, is something safe and is something not?
Yeah.
It happens without consciousness, and it happens, and this is what gets so interesting from my perspective, is it happens in the context of all of our previous life experiences, right? I mean, I always think about the example, right? I mean, the classic example of the YouTube videos where they set the baby down in the grass for the first time.
Yeah.
And every time the baby most of the time, the baby picks up their little legs like, what in the world is this? I don't know what this is.
Yes, threat. Pick
up your legs.
Yeah.
And then, usually the parent says, oh, it's okay. Look, it's soft. Try again. And you can almost see the neuroceptive quality in the baby's brain changing. They're like, wait a second, this is actually okay. And then, before then you know it, they're like eating the grass. And so tell me a little bit about, I think most of the people listening probably very well understand physical safety, right? Like, what is physical safety? What are the other kinds of safety, though, that our brains, our neuroception is attuning into?
Yeah. Between one another, it's relational safety. Am I going to be emotionally safe? Am I going to be attuned? Are you going to see me? Are you going to hear me? Am I going to be emotionally safe within this context? And I think it's It's really interesting to me, this whole topic, because it makes me think that like the human body gets in the way of what's going on here because we are so instinctual.
Mm-hmm.
And you kind of coined some of it already, that this idea of neuroception is based on, if we want to geek out on neuroscience a little bit, our amygdala, so our fear centers and our hippocampus, our memory, trying to scan back that, is this going to be a safe encounter for me? And it depends based on what our previous experiences are, because we are pattern meaning maker machines. So what we're all doing is recalling, if this, whether it be relational, like I said, or emotional, or sensation too, when it comes from like a sensory perspective, similar to what you said about the grass touching me, is this safe? So we're looking at it from like multiple angles of, yes, physical, emotional, relational, and from a sensory perspective. And when you look at it in the brain, it's kind of like a little hierarchy of like, that brain stem is going to be activated with threats of safety within the environment.
Yeah.
So is this grass going to be safe for my body, right? Is the environment safe? And our limbic system might be activated when it has to do with emotional safety. So it's these different areas that might be triggered. And the most beautiful thing, I think, when I look at this topic is that we are just wired to know how to support this. I think it gets confusing when you're supporting your kid or your loved one, because it comes so natural. I like to think of it like animals. It really comes natural to us of how to support the safety. And we could kind of talk more about that. I'll be curious about the things that you use with, your clients and just people in your life around like what signals we're offering people that we are safe. But it really helps me to think about, how would I interact with like a timid little puppy?
It's so interesting that you say it that way. I was just thinking as you were talking, what are some of the things we see in our kids,
Yeah.
right? Where us as occupational therapists and parent coaches, we identify that as, oh, their system isn't feeling safe. But what are some of the things we see in the kids that we work with?
Yeah.
Or the kids that we're supporting at home?
Yeah. I think this is the hardest part, because I think so often we forget how underdeveloped the brain is. And so
of a young child,
yes. And so we go throughout our day, right? You're a parent and you've got all the to-dos to do to keep your child safe and healthy, and that comes with a lot. And there's going to be bumps in the road of disruption from your child around melting down, kicking, hitting, screaming,
and saying no.
Saying no.
Nauseam, right?
Yeah. Or like physically, like I've got a almost 4-year-old, and, she kicked me this morning because she wasn't ready to get up. Right. And it's not like she's consciously saying like, Mommy, I'm not safe, or, there's a range of things that are going on with her. But I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that when our kids get into this state where their behaviors are, we can't really understand what's going on with their behaviors, and they might be acting out aggressively with their body or with their words. I think very often we use our adult brain and say this was intentional.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's so easy to go there. It feels so intentional when you're the recipient, said kick in the stomach or whatever it was.
Exactly. So I think introducing and just having knowledge about this idea of felt safety between us is really important, because of you're going to use your adult brain and say, of course they're safe. Of course they are. But I want us to take a step back and just get a little bit more curious from the perspective of the child, what might truly be going on, and them not being consciously aware, but bringing curiosity to not assuming that the kick in the gut was intentional.
You're describing the different brain states. You're just describing what we call a fight-flight response. Right?
Yeah.
All of our brains go into a fight-flight response when that idea of threat is up.
Yeah.
The other way we protect ourselves in those moments of lack of safety is a freeze response. We tend to talk about the fight-flight a little bit more because it's a little bit more in our faces. What does that freeze response look like in I'm going to keep it as in our children right now, but quickly we're going to start looking at ourselves as parents and adults supporting kids.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that when we get into like a lower phase than that fight or flight, if we're going to look at, referencing the polyvagal theory, which is at my lowest, most survival state, is to be immobilized, to shut down, to avoid, to ignore. Yeah, what else do you see in that dorsal vagal state of shut down for preservation or survival?
It's so interesting because then the kids that I work with and that we see and that have parented, that can sometimes look like, well, they're just not listening.
Yeah.
They won't answer me. They're not responding to their name, right? They won't move their face off the screen. And sometimes I think that gives it some power to sort of label it a free state some of the time, which is the brain's way of trying to make sense and find safety somewhere.
Yeah. When the child at school who holds it together a lot, they go into the classroom and, the parent might have behavioral concerns at home, quote unquote, behavioral concerns at home, but at school, they're like perfect little angels. And the teacher has no concerns and everything is lovely. I can't believe they would ever act out or talk back. What? So when I see that disconnect, it makes me want to ask some questions and it makes me want to get curious. And
about what's happening at school.
About the child felt safety at school. Are they masking? Are they locking up for a reason why they can't understand? They won't be able to articulate, but they're holding it together because they don't feel fully safe. And that could be for multiple reasons, depending on their individual profile, depending on the environment. So depending on their past history and the experiences they've had with other attachment figures. So the list could go on, but that's a big one that I see a lot that comes up and up and up again. And then the kid that holds it together, of course, is going to release that, right? At home and in their safe spot.
Yes, all the time.
Yeah.
So, as we talk about what it looks like when there might be a lack of felt sense of safety for our kids, let's start thinking about what we do. Like, how do we as parents and caregivers lay that foundation for that felt sense of safety for our kids?
I mean, this is always like the trial and the error and the inner workings of the individual profile and the authenticity that comes out of you that's going to really land or not. So let's give grace to play and be curious here because it's not going to hit home every single time. However, like we do know, like it's proven that, for example, a prosodic voice will actually lower our physiological stress response. So our heart rate will slow down. So what this looks like is my voice might go up a little bit and it might come down a little bit. Okay, there's some rhythm to it. There's some waves to it. This automatically tells me that I'm not a threat to you, that I am safe. And so this is what I was talking about earlier in the episode around we naturally have this. We naturally will do this with babies. We'll naturally do this with little kitties or little puppies. Our voice will naturally, we know it's kind of embedded in us for a lot of us. Some people have to work at it. But for a lot of us, that it's kind of a natural thing that we have in us that we kind of already do know how to give signals of safety. Other signs of safety is predictability.
Yes. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah.
There's many ways to create predictability, but the thing I always think about is predictability of response from your caregiver.
Yeah.
I feel like, if we're creatures who seek connection, and if we frankly are reliant upon our caregivers for the first, at least 15 years of life-ish to keep us alive, when we look to our caregiver for that, if we have a predictable response from them, right? If we say, ow, predictably, they're like, come here, let's talk, or I gotcha. I find that inherently creates a sense of safety It helps lay the foundations for safety. My caregiver is going to respond to me the same way every time, and hopefully in a attuned, regulated way, but they're going to respond to me the same way every time based on my needs in the moment.
Yep. So there's no guessing what's going to happen.
Right? There's no guessing that one time when I need them, they're going to scream at me. And then one time when I need them, they're going to straight up ignore me. But then that third time, they might see my need.
Yeah.
That creates a nervous system and a neuroceptive sense of like, ooh, I have to be on high alert because I don't know what person I'm getting today.
Yeah. Yeah. That's beautiful. Mm-hmm. And that's so needed. Another thing that I know that could really support, and I'm being like intentionally more mindful in my sessions too, with some of my more radar up kiddos, is that immediate connection, like right when I see them in the waiting room, mm-hmm. you know, I'm approaching them, right? Mm-hmm. So what does my body look like? So our little radars are going to sense like a little bit of movement in your face as safe. When it becomes a little bit stiff with the body, especially if we're standing over the child, mm-hmm. and the face gets a little bit fixed, it's a little bit harder to read what's going on within.
And what is the research? Is it 90% of what we take in comes from nonverbal communication?
Oh, I don't even know.
I think it's 90% is nonverbal, 10% is verbal. And so, right, we could be saying the most beautiful things in the world, but if our nonverbals are giving off cues of I'm tired, I don't really like you, and I don't want to be here, no matter what we say, is it going to be felt by that neuroceptive sense as safe?
Yeah. We talk about that a lot with some of my clients around this idea of, is my internal experience matching my external experience?
Let's talk about that.
It's such an important one. And I think that sometimes as parents, we feel a lot of pressure and like we know kind of like what our child might need, mm-hmm. but our body might not be able to provide it because like we had a long day or we're stressed or we just want them to get to the table to eat the food that I made you, that I bought you, right? But the child, especially the sensitive child, is going to pick up on that mismatch and going to view that as a threat. So this is where like kind of the conversation might start going into more of like, how do we support ourselves to like feel safe within our body, to feel regulated within our body, to give us grace to feel a range of emotions and still have it be safe for our child while being authentic to ourselves, which sometimes those collide and can't always happen.
They can't always happen. And I think that it's where some of the power is to really find safety in ourselves as adults. And what does that even mean, right? So we've been talking about, finding safety in kids, but what does that mean to find safety in ourselves as adults?
I don't know. That's a good question.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's around like we're reading our own internal cues and we're attuning to ourselves and our own needs.
I always think of this, when we're in the hardest of the hard, when we're in an interaction with our child who is having a meltdown because you said no more electronics today, right? Yeah. There's a classic one. And, that feeling that pops up in ourselves. I felt this as a parent. I felt this as a therapist, that feeling that pops up in ourselves of, it's like almost like a raising heat in my body of like, I don't know if I can do this again. Like, I don't know if this is, where I'm in this now. And I feel like finding safety in ourselves is being able to have that experience, to being able to feel like, oh, this is really kind of horrible right now.
Yeah.
And when you're able to feel it in that way, you can make some sense of it up in your brain.
Yeah.
Right. You have some frontal lobe ability to say, yeah, this is pretty horrible right now. Later on, I'm going to go download on my partner, or I'm going to go, zone out to my phone. Let's be realistic. We're not going to take bubble baths and do yoga. I'm going to do something. It'd be great if we could, but I'm going to do something that's just for me later on. Even that idea that I can feel it in my body and know that I'm going to sort of make it through this.
And there's articulation there, right?
Yeah.
So like, just like what your kids are going through, we're going through it too. So what is that internal response that we might be feeling? Is it fear response? Mm-hmm. So is it protection state? Mm-hmm. Am I going to avoid this? I'm going to just like throw my hands up in the air and like, oh, fine. Like, I'm not even going to fight them today because electronics, like, it's too much to deal with. I don't want to go into it with them because they're just going to freak out and it's just too much. So that's more of like, I'm going to protect myself. Or is it this fight or flight, like fear response where I might like raise my voice and, yell, or that's when the demands and the threats that later you might regret, like start to seep in. And then there's just this idea of just generalized stress, right? Like my nervous system is just totally zapped. But these are the 3 stress response that our body's always going to go into: fear, protection, stress. Fear, protection, stress. So better knowing kind of what's going on for you might be really helpful if you have this space of noticing that like, yeah, like my relationship to getting kicked in the gut, like it's extra for me, or that physical sensation. And knowing what you need to do to best support your child that might do that is just such a huge conversation to dive into, I think. But the more language we have around it, the more we could realize kind of what strategy we need to allow ourselves that grace to get into a regulated state, to use some of these theories to bring your child into safety.
And so what I hear you saying, like if we really boil it down, is that the awareness that we have of ourselves in the moments and the ability to either honor our need for safety or verbalize our lack of safety or express what's happening for us either in the moment or later on, if it's not appropriate in the moment, is key to sort of maybe being the grounding force for creating the safety in our child. So if we're able to sort of set the example, right, for our child of what that is like, what that experience is like of pulling ourselves back into an understanding of safety, that then kind of helps pull them along in the idea that they too can be safe, even if we're having extreme emotions, or even if we're in a distress response, or even if mom and dad said no more electronics tonight, we can still be okay. We are still safe. We might not like it, but we're still safe.
Yeah. And maybe it could help here to like bring in some examples. So I could like pull in a few from my life being a mother of 2. And then Jen, maybe like you could speak to like the older child or the teen. But so, and this like, definitely goes into idea of co-regulation as well. But my son, he's 1 year old, and I will still rock him to sleep and kind of do like a nice little dance and sing to him. And sometimes I'm really fried at the end of my day. And I notice that there's a flavor of dysregulation he'll have right before bed that sometimes is not him saying, "Mommy, calm me down," but "Mommy, hold this space for me to let this out." And that could be a lot on my nervous system at that point. And it like seeps into me and I just get a little bit more chaotic. But what I've been starting to practice more is not asking the question, what does my son need in this moment? But what do I need in this moment?
Yes.
And it's really interesting because I'm noticing that like, okay, and it's just little things. So what I'm noticing is like, I ask myself that question. And so I'm like, it feels good to close my eyes. Okay. And it feels good to like sway a little bit. Because right now I know he does need me standing up, and there's certain limits of what I can do to support him that he does need. But within that framework, what do I need? And automatically that shifts, like it just like I'm on a different channel and it shifts me completely, and it allows him to get out what he needs. And it's just so much easier with this knowledge of like, help yourself, Shannon, help yourself before you're going to help your kid. But it inevitably helps him. So that's one example for a little tiny one.
For a little one. And what you're doing is he's experiencing some big emotions, it sounds like. He's working through, emotions of his day as little ones do, usually fairly physically, right? And you're holding space for him so that he has a felt sense of safety in all his emotions.
Yes.
And that's what we're going for. The goal is not to always feel happy and joyful. I mean, that'd be amazing. But to have that felt sense of safety within our whole human experience is what we're looking for. It's interesting because as you were telling that story, I have teenagers, and so I have had an example recently where I needed to tell one of my kiddos something, just some information about, their sport that was distressing to them, that caused a lot of disappointment, that was something that they didn't want. They wanted me to fix it and change it, and it wasn't something I could fix or change for them. And in the same way, I found myself pausing, feeling the sensation of discomfort and sort of a fear response of here we go again, right? I'm going to be in this verbal battle with this very dysregulated teenager.
Yeah.
And found that when I was able to stop and pause and truly just focus on, I was drinking like a glass of water at the moment. I literally just focused on drinking that glass of water for like 3 seconds. My teenager, who was fairly dysregulated, was able to take that cue. I verbalized for my teenager, wow, you're really upset about this. They were able to take that cue, and they ended up stomping up to their room, going to their room in order to give themselves a safety break.
Yeah.
So in that case, that felt sense of safety, because teenagers are supposed to be pulling away and doing that a little bit more. But had I responded in a big way and tried to fix or tried to express my lack of sense of safety onto them, that would have just dysregulated us both. And we both would have felt fairly unsafe in that moment. But because I was able to, in that moment, and not always able to do this, model, hey, I'm just going to take a minute here because we're not going to resolve this right now. They went and they did their thing and then came back and was able to talk about it later.
Beautiful. It's so easy to get into that reactive ping and pong to land there. But really what this is saying is, how do we find sturdiness within ourselves to be like, wait a sec, maybe I don't have to serve that tennis ball that you gave me. Maybe I could start changing the conversation here a little bit. And there's so much nuance in that dance. And it's interesting how just a small little shift can make such a big difference.
Yeah.
Like a check-in.
Yeah. And I didn't have to pick up the rope of you're being inappropriate or you shouldn't talk to me that way or any of that, because it wasn't about that.
Yeah.
It was about discomfort in the moment. These shifts, it's interesting because as we talk, I'm just like, wow, how do we give the concretes? Because these shifts are so subtle, right?
They really are.
They're so subtle. And that's the beauty of it, is it's not like you have to do a whole lot all the time.
No, and it really does come down to the profile and the age of the child.
And so as we wrap up, I want to be able to give our parents a couple of nuggets around finding safety. So we're going to go home and we're going to go back to our lives. Be like, all right, how do we find the safety? How do we do this?
Yeah, I mean, I think one big one is, an idea versus a specific strategy, but knowing that a lot of when our child gets into this fight or flight response, just being more aware that, oh, this is a fight or flight response, or this is a shutdown response. So knowing that that's the conversation that's existing for them, and it's not a choice. And they're not doing this to you intentionally.
We meet it differently.
Yeah.
We meet it differently.
Yeah.
We meet it through safety signals, as opposed to sort of cognitive-based consequence, that kind of thing. We meet it with safety signals.
Yeah, because we need to talk to the brain that's activated. And so the brain's going to respond to those safety signals that you're saying.
And so some of the safety signals we've given are prosody of voice, facial expression, nonverbals.
Yeah.
Paying attention to our own internal sense of safety, because the kids are, through co-regulation, going to shift off of us. Predictability, creating a sense of predictability in our responses so that they can know what to expect. And the other thing I think that's important is for the kids to know that we're seeing them. We see you. We see that this is really hard.
Yeah.
Connection
before
correction. That's one of our favorite statements around here. Connection before correction. Yeah. I think we're going to leave it there for today. Thank you so much for joining me. Great. I'm sure we will chit-chat again in the near future.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Jen.
If you like what you heard today, check out our Empowered Parent Coaching course offered through Thriving Parents Collective. In this course, you will get videos and course content to help you learn and develop the strategies you seek to meet your child right where they're at. Go to the show notes for the link. Where They're Planted is a Lit Path Studios podcast and is produced by Jamie Gale and Jen Bluske. Music is by Gaston Reen and Pod 5. Thank you for loving your child right where they're planted.